Perfect. Okay, I will pass over to Dr. Aggrey and Dr. Drakes to introduce themselves, and then we'll pass back to Dr. Aggrey for his presentation.
Okay, I'm still navigating my way on Microsoft Teams. This is my first time of using it for presentation, so bear with me if I mess up the system. Well, as Joshua said, my name is John Aggrey. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech. I study infectious diseases, but from a social science perspective. My research in the past and still ongoing has been on risk perception. I've done that for Ebola and COVID. I'm interested in the risk perception process. I'm currently writing a book, Risk Realities, that extends and expands today's presentation, where I'm looking at people's risk perception through their relational ties, their relational networks. I have other works that also focuses on epidemic preparedness, thinking of epidemic preparedness through human relationship. Actually, there's an edited book coming out next month that I conceptualize human relations as a form of infrastructure for that. And I've done that basically looking at urban and rural towns in Africa. Thank you.
That's fantastic. We're really lucky to have you here, Dr. Aggrey. And Dr. Drakes.
Thank you, Joshua. And I'm so happy to see John, who I've known for a few years now, but we haven't run into each other for a while. So good afternoon, all. My name is Oronde Drakes. I'm a physical scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey, working in the Integrated Information Dissemination Division of the Water Resources Mission Area. But while my title says physical scientist, I'm actually a geographer by training, and I'm one of the few social scientists within the U.S. Geological Survey. And so my work combines a lot of the quantitative spatial analysis that you traditionally associate with physical science with the qualitative side of geography, trying to understand context. And that combination is really important in my work because I look at multiple hazards, social vulnerability. So not just where the event is happening, but which are the people or the groups that are affected, how those effects change over time, over place and space, and based on social and institutional context and processes that these populations are navigating. I also co-chair the Human Dimensions Community of Practice within the U.S. Geological Survey. So that's where all of the social scientists and those who want to work with social scientists in the Bureau come together to discuss issues of fundamental science practices to just general, hey, what's going on? This is a cool new project that I'm working on. I'd like some feedback and get that perspective from a wide breadth of styles, of disciplines, and of stages in career. And I'll give the floor back to John now.
Okay, let me share my presentation. See how this works. Okay, can you all see my slides? Okay, great. All right, so thank you all for coming. So this study is situated in Ghana, during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa between 2014 and 2016. Let's pause for a moment, okay? Let's think back to COVID-19, the early days of COVID-19, say January 2022, about the summer of 2020. Think about the uncertainties you had to deal with in trying to stay safe, and avoid infection. I bet some of the uncertainties include what you see on your screen now. These uncertainties are common in emerging infectious disease epidemic context, especially where the virus or the pathogen is new in the human population. Now, in the course of the epidemic, these uncertainties are mitigated and eliminated by the development of new scientific knowledge. However, we are faced with the uncertainty of infection, right? The uncertainty of being exposed, infected, and suffering the harm of infection. Mitigating the risk of infection in epidemics requires specific information on the causative pathogen, the risk characteristics, the modes of transmission, etc. Now, this information is disseminated via risk communication channels, which informs and influences individuals' risk perception and the adoption of appropriate health behaviors. The underlying assumption is that hazard information informs risk perception and the adoption of the corresponding health behaviors. So then during epidemics, there's a lot of emphasis on getting accurate information to people whilst reducing inaccurate information. But I argue that the epidemic context is complex, right? It's saturated with diverse forms of information. And then individuals utilize a combination of these information sources, which they deem relevant to the context to construct a sense of risk. So for me, the central question is, how do people construct a sense of risk amidst these uncertainties and the multiplicity of information sources in the epidemic context? I do this by conceptualizing risk as a knowledge construct. Now, information is vital and integral to constructing a sense of risk. Without information on the risk object and or its putative harm, one cannot develop a sense of risk towards the risk object. However, constructing a sense of risk is not simply an act of information consumption. It goes through a constructed and negotiated process that emerges from the interactions of diverse actors in the epidemic context. Risk, from the socio-constructionist perspective, is not a pre-existing fact waiting to be perceived, but it is a constructed, negotiated, and a situated reality that occurs through social interactions and mean information. Thus, constructing a sense of risk in the epidemic context occurs through mean information via social interactions and encounters with various entities like the disease itself, the devastating effects you may witness on TV or through social media, media discourses, communal beliefs, etc. Therefore, risk perception in epidemics is more of a conglomeration of meanings, logics, and beliefs that cohere around material phenomena, and which gives this phenomena form and substance. And they can only be known and experienced through particular social context. Contexts are an integral part of epidemics. The presence that is having the virus in the population, or the absent presence, the information about the virus in an affected or at-risk population, enact the epidemic context as an actor in a network of relations. I use actor here in the Latourian sense, where actor refers to both human and non-human entities that are made active, visible by their networks. They are enabled by these networks. So then the pathogen's presence or its absent presence actively enables other actors as the epidemic unfolds. Think of the media and its coverage of stories around the epidemic, social media interactions around the epidemic, institutions that act in response to the epidemic. These are all enabled actors made visible, triggered into effect by the epidemic. Now, these enabled actors may influence relations forged with other actors in the epidemic context. Risk is therefore tied to the context of the network of relations for which it emerges. And it's influenced by these enabled factors. We'll talk more about these factors later on. Risk is not a passive result of diverse actors interacting within the epidemic. These actors, these enabled actors, together with other actors in the epidemic context, once they are activated, actively participate in the translation process, which in turn shapes the perception and the response to the epidemic. Individuals develop an impression of the causative pathogen through the information they consume, and then drawing on their internalized schema of danger and disease, they make sense of this information. The initial interpretation based on the person's impression of the pathogen is further shaped by one's understanding of vulnerability. This may trigger a sense of fear, concern, or worry, and may cause behavioral change. Since risk construction is a negotiated process, the initial construct is further shaped through one's social interactions, involving network information on the enabled factors, the pathogen, or the disease narratives. This risk knowledge is constructed to produce the real existence of a phenomenon with specific characteristics, which are based on the person's experience, social interactions, and the context from which it emerges. This knowledge is socially accepted. It is held to be true, and it influences risk perception and health behavior. Now, given the fact that things rapidly evolve in epidemic context, this constructed risk knowledge is not static, it is relational. It evolves in response to the multiple informations consumed, the interactions of with various actors, and the shifting dynamics of the epidemic. I did a study in Ghana, and the principal question is why Ghana? If you look at the map at the time, we had cases of Ebola around where Ghana is located. There were various cases, but there was no case in Ghana. Now, Ghana, because of its geographic location and its ecological factors, those elements made it conducive for animal to human transmission. Secondly, at the time of the epidemic, it was classified as a higher risk country because of the high influx of travelers across the West Africa corridor. Most countries you see on the map, there's a lot of travel that occurs between people within these countries for economic reasons and for multiple reasons. So then it makes it a higher risk country, which was at risk at the time of having cases. Also, Ghana has porous borders or porous points of entry or unapproved borders where people use in entering the country. And the third reason is modern epidemics are not simply biologic events. They are informational, which produces local interactions about risk that can transform distant places and actors into risk objects. And at the time, Ghanaians were exhibiting varied health behaviors in response to the diverse information they were consuming, even though there was never a case in there. So it made sense to look at those dynamics. And so I do this comparing three locations: Accra, Ghana's capital city. I look at Hohoe, which is a town close to Ghana's border with Togo to the east. And then Ewusijo is a village in the western region of Ghana, close to Ghana's border with Côte d'Ivoire. Constructing a sense of risk entails an encounter with a risk object. In this case, an encounter with the virus, the Ebola virus, embodied in an infected person or space. However, since Ghana never had a case of Ebola, what Ghanaians encountered was the absent presence of the virus. They encountered the virus through diverse information sources. These encounters occurred via local and international news media, social media. WhatsApp and Facebook was, at the time, the key thing that people used. And then they were exposed to information about the existence of the virus. The horrific characteristics of the virus, high case fatality, rapid rate of infection, etc. Now, their initial encounters did not trigger a sense of fear. It was the constant media reportage which highlighted the deadly characteristics of the virus, which piqued people's sensibilities to the potential dangers associated with the disease and created a perception of a near certain death upon infection. Now, central to all these encounters was the consumption of Ebola-related information. And then that nascent realization, which eventually became a social consensus on the deadly nature of the virus. This fear generated conversations within people, within people's social networks, where it became part of their daily conversation with friends, family, and colleagues. They had repeated conversations multiple times among different nodes in their social network. This reinforced the information shared, and consumed. Another place where they encountered the virus was what I call abnormal encounters. These are mainly churches, schools, mosques, and the workplace. Abnormal in the sense of being out of the norm. There are spaces where you wouldn't usually encounter such diseases. But then more importantly, there are spaces where social actors were required to adopt preventive behaviors in order to interact with such spaces, which was out of the norm because ordinarily you go to school without having to adopt these preventive measures or go to church without having to do that. But because of the virus, they were forced to do it. It became a condition to interact in such spaces. And in such spaces, too, information about the disease was shared by way of educating them. So then these abnormal encounters occurred in response to the absent presence of the virus and the potential danger inherent in the epidemic. These institutions enrolled social actors into the Ebola virus network and sustained Ebola's presence through information dissemination. These informational encounters were generative for the respondents. For some of them, it augmented, clarified, affirmed, and reinforced their knowledge of Ebola, helping them to develop an idea of Ebola as a risk object laden with deadly harm. This seeded the development of an Ebola construct that shaped their risk knowledge and precautionary behavior. These informational encounters were also transformative. It placed respondents on edge after discussing and realizing their risk exposure, and then they altered their behavior in response. In all three locations, respondents adopted various health behaviors in response to their formed risk knowledge, which emerged from the multiple information sources consumed, their social and institutional interactions, disease narratives within their networks, and their individual interpretations of the pathogen and the epidemic context. As we can see from this quote, the respondent's precautionary behavior stemmed from her impression and interpretation of Ebola as a dangerous disease based on its mode of transmission and the certainty of death upon infection, because at the time there was no vaccine. Vaccine was still being developed. So then situating her interpretation of the disease in context, riding the bus triggered fear upon realizing the magnitude of her risk exposure. Therefore, her consequent avoidance of human contact arose from her situated risk knowledge. For these respondents, the characteristics of Ebola became the identifiers through which they thought and talked about the disease, and it influenced their notion of the virus and the disease, generating fear and helping them grasp the uncertainty of infection in relation to their circumstances. Fear was a function of the horrific characteristics of Ebola and its perceived severity and the imagination of gruesome symptoms. As an actor, Ebola, with its terrifying characteristics, transformed numerous interactive spaces and influenced the development of the diverse risk knowledge constructs observed during the epidemic. First, it transformed social interactions between friends, family, colleagues, such that they exercise caution in their daily activities. Second, it transformed interactions between actors, social actors, and institutions, that they altered their behavior in response to the uncertainty of exposure and infection. And finally, it elicited a diversity of reactions from social actors in response to the absent presence of the virus. The absent presence of Ebola in Ghana triggered enabled factors that influence people's risk perception. So enabled factors basically are factors that are made active, made visible in the epidemic context. They evolve with the epidemic, and then they influence people's risk perception. So in Ghana's case, we were dealing with some of them were the government's policy on screening at the borders, confirmation that there were no cases of Ebola in the country, and the geographic location of the epidemic. Information on these three enabled factors was used in divergent ways in different locations, influencing disease or pathogen notions, risk knowledge, and causing some respondents to alter their precautionary behavior, while others were adamant in maintaining their ordinary practices. In Accra and Hohoe, some respondents changed their behavior in response to the information that there were no cases in the country. The second quote is by a taxi driver who was telling me about his experience of passengers who came to the study station to take taxis. We can see that these changes described indicate the respondent's initial risk knowledge and behavioral change in response to the information of the absence of the disease in the country. Although they knew that Ebola is deadly and transmissible through bodily contact, they were no longer perturbed by the susceptibility, by their own susceptibility amidst the uncertainty of encountering an unknown infected person. The absence of Ebola cases relieved these respondents of any fear and eliminated the uncertainty of infection. However, the majority of respondents did not alter their behavior, especially those in Accra and Hohoe. Even after processing the information that there are no cases in the country. Although such information was comforting, it did not eradicate the fear associated with the virus, nor did it eliminate the dangers associated with the disease or the probability of future cases. Now, situating this new information did not modify their initial conceptions of the disease as dangerous, neither did it alter their risk knowledge. They were cognizant of the uncertainty of exposure and infection, and thus observed the safety protocols. But in the village in Ewusuojo, the information of the absence of the disease further eroded any fear associated with the disease, or and it influenced their risk knowledge. They were aware of the transmission mechanism, but were unconcerned due to the absence of cases. This information on the enabled factors boosted their confidence in interacting with others without the fear of infection. On border screening, we see different dynamics as well. In Accra and Hohoe, some respondents reduced their risk assessment. They noted that the border policy assuaged their fear of infection and explained why there were no cases in the country. However, some respondents indicated that the screening of the borders was not enough to guarantee their safety. Living in Accra, which is a major transit point, puts them at risk. For those in Hohoe, given that they are close to the border with Togo and the fact that Ghana has porous ports of entry, these dynamics made social interactions unsafe, reinforcing the need to adopt precautionary measures rather than give them up. In the Ewusuojo, it was the opposite. For respondents, they were like, there's no need to fear. The border screening policy meant they were safe, and there was no need for adopting these preventive measures. With regards to geographic location, respondents in the Ewusuojo drew on Ghana's distance from the epicenter of the outbreak, from Ghana's distance from Liberia and Sierra Leone in developing that risk construct. For Ewusuojo residents, distance from Ghana's port of entry became a metric of determining the safety of the community. They argued that reported cases would commence with the border towns and the cities, since those were the major routes of entry into the country. They had nothing to worry about. As an actor, Ebola transformed spaces and actors in Accra and Hohoe, but it was transformed in Ewusuojo, the village. Its deadly characteristics were considered less potent given its distance from the village and the absence of cases in the country. Ebola's constructed presence dissipated upon encountering these enabled factors, which ironically were triggered by the virus's dangerous characteristics. These enabled factors produce different sets of interpretations and reactions to Ebola's deadly and dreadful characteristics. So then we see that in addition to the disease itself, information on the disease, accurate information, etc., network information, that is information that flowed within people's own networks and how they made meaning of the disease, and information on these enabled factors influence risk knowledge in the epidemic context. The diversity of reactions and interactions demonstrate the movement, interpretations, negotiations, and transformation of relationships and actors within the Ebola virus network. These various actors were not passive, but actively they were involved in translating the dreadful features of Ebola into numerous interactive spaces and social interactions, which yielded a variety of situated risk, knowledge, and transformations. Conceptualizing risk as a knowledge construct in epidemics reveals that risk construction goes beyond the influence of accurate and inaccurate information. It also reveals the diversity of risk perceptions and acceptable health behaviors in the epidemic context, while detailing the multiplicity of actors in a complex network of relations in risk formation. This network perspective underscores the significance of examining the risk formation process in designing and evaluating risk communication strategies and adopting multifaceted, contextually grounded strategies for managing infectious disease epidemics. Thank you.
That was so interesting, Dr. Aggrey, and I have so many questions for you. For everyone else who has questions, please do write them down so that we've got them noted and ready to go. But let's, in the interest of time, move on to Dr. Drakes for your presentation, after which there will be the opportunity for joint Q&A, which I will pass over to Dr. Farah Nibs, who's on the call now, to lead the Q&A. So over to yourself, Dr. Drakes.
Thank you. So my talk today will be on multi-hazard vulnerability and risk. And as a geographer, I will be focusing on the place and space aspects mostly. Now, a significant portion of my research career has covered disaster risk management in Guyana and South America. However, given the office that I'm representing today, I'll focus this talk on the US, and we can chat about the other work if there is interest in time at another point. So I'm in the decision support branch of the Integrated Information Dissemination Division of the Water Resources Mission Area of the US Geological Survey. And what that really means is I really function at the endpoint of a research pipeline, where our goal is to get as much of the most useful points of the research that we're doing in the Bureau to those who need it most. Now, social scientists are not common in the agency that I represent. So you might be wondering, why am I here? The Water Resources Mission Area is just one part of 5 missions in the survey. And we look at risk across all of these mission areas in varying roles and responsibilities. So either directly or indirectly, USGS is participating in things like volcanoes, landslides, mud flows and debris flows, earthquakes, geomagnetic risk, biological risk, as well as flooding and coastal hazards. So we're covering a very broad array of risk and risk factors in this bureau. And being in the Water Resources Mission Area, my major focus is on too much or too little of the wet stuff. So for the legal parts of this, any mention of specific product or trade names is not an endorsement by the US government. And some of this data is preliminary, and I've included an indication on the slides where that preliminary information is presented. So on to the meat of this. My research is on social vulnerability, but it's on multiple hazard social vulnerability. As you can see from this graphic that I've borrowed, multi-hazard doesn't just mean one thing, and it can quickly become very complex. Now, much of the research that looks at multiple hazard focuses on the what, the where, and the physical origins of these hazards. So the complexity rises when you start to include the social and societal drivers of risk. I'll be talking about these societal determinants today. So the academic community has long identified that in general, hazard events aren't really increasing significantly in number, at least not over the last few decades. But the intensity of some of these events has been shifting, and there is a significant increase in the observed severity of the impacts that are associated with those events. But that increase in severity is not fully accounted for by that increase in intensity. So even though there are higher frequency, lower magnitude events that are producing more severe impacts, there are also now more people in harm's way. So you can start asking, well, why are those people located where they are, exposed to those hazards? There's also more stuff. There's more infrastructure, more crops, more livestock, more amusement parks, more cars, more everything that is exposed to these events. So there's also now an increased likelihood of losses when an event does occur, no matter the magnitude of that event. And finally, there is also increased precarity. Losses are more likely to be incurred in an event by those exposed individuals, those exposed households, communities, governments, those institutions that are there. And they're less likely to be able to withstand the effects of those losses. So, what's driving this pattern? And my response to that is it's social vulnerability, right? Or more accurately, social vulnerability producing conditions, because the people themselves aren't inherently vulnerable. It's the interacting social and institutional and societal processes that create disproportionate likelihoods to suffer harm and lower capacities to cope with or deal with and then recover from those harms once they're incurred. And these are the social determinants of risk. And we can look at them in single hazard fashion, but often people are not just recovering from one event, right? You may have a flood this week, and then next year you're not fully recovered and there's another flood, or there's a storm, or there's something else that's going on. So there are these multiple layers of events that you're interacting with. And as a society, you're not just interacting with multiple layers of individual events. Some events are strung together. So one produces another. For example, we may be suffering a drought, but then when there's an intense rainfall event happening after that drought, you're more likely to have a flood. Now, if there was a wildfire in between those two things, you have a lot more stuff just sitting on the ground, which then gets washed into rivers, streams, or other waterways, creating greater potential for flooding, but also influencing things like water quality, which then impacts, well, who can access water, how good that water is, do you have to pay more for that, and does that have knock-on effects on other sectors? So if we look at this, we're really seeing two things happening here. There's the physical hazard, and then there's a disaster. And it's these societal determinants of risk that are turning hazard physical events into disasters, which are socially constructed events. So let's take a quick look at an example of how these vulnerability producing processes impact outcomes. And I'll present a few examples from societal institutions broadly defined. Disaster assistance, in this case, in my first case, will be used to illustrate outcomes. And then later on, I'll look at much broader processes. So in this first case, I'll be looking at disaster assistance from the federal government of the United States, and government institutions and general institutions of power have decision-making abilities that are near to the root of hazard disaster outcomes, both positive and negative, because they're responding to a lot of need. And if you can determine what need is, who has need, and various levels of need, then you have a lot of power in determining what the outcomes are of particular events. So populations use any available resources to absorb impacts from hazard events, and to manage needs is highly influential in creating disproportionate disaster outcomes. Because if you've got more resources, you do better than those who struggle to access resources, right? You have more potential for not just recovery, but a quicker and more full recovery. And this is a core component of vulnerability. Households will rely on things like insurance and personal savings and their social capital to withstand disaster effects. And disaster effects are not just, oh, I've lost property. Sometimes people lose jobs, right? It's your damaged residences and all of the memories that you have there, but the wider personal possessions and your ability to then enact capital in future opportunities is also reduced. So households with fewer personal resources are less able to overcome these challenges. Federal programs respond to those unmet coping needs. Short-term assistance provides additional means to address deficits in the ability to cope. But you could ask, who receives that assistance? And is it enough to meet their needs? Now, it's important to note that I'll be looking at the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Individuals and Households program. And this is really an option of last resort and is one of a suite of potential resources available after an event. And those resources are available at different times and provide different amounts of assistance. So I assessed the largest component of this program, individual assistance, for 2006 to 2018 period at the zip code level, which is the lowest aggregation that was available at the time. And I looked at homeowners and renters as separate populations. Now, this aligns social vulnerability index using Susan Cutter's SOVI method with losses. And because the program has several different sub-programs, repair and replace, which helps you to literally repair and replace lost possessions, rental assistance, which allows you to move into rental properties in the period that it takes to recover your own home, and other needs assistance that allows you to pay for funerals and that sort of stuff. And I use some geospatial techniques to account for the various arrangements of locations across space. So implementing the care nearest neighbor matrix allowed me to look at where things are happening, not just what is going on, and to take account for that spatial arrangement of the data set that we're looking at here. And looked at the value of damages, because that was the major predictor and the major factor that is being considered in a lot of these programs. So we actually revealed distinct patterns in the disbursement of assistance and the social characteristics of the places receiving that assistance. Places where the program seemed to be underperforming, that is, there were lower levels of federal assistance associated with higher levels of social vulnerability. And if social vulnerability is increased, you expect to have more need for assistance, are on this map revealed in places in red. And that's suggestive that you're not adequately reaching those most in need. And those places in red are clustered in the Mississippi Valley, in Appalachia, and they were mostly rural in nature. Whereas places where the program seems to be overperforming, so there are higher levels of assistance in places with lower levels of social need, were clustered in the Northeast and in the Midwest, and they were mostly urban in nature. So this reliance on the dollar value of damage may be driving inequity in how assistance was distributed. But then we took a closer look and not just figured out, okay, where are things happening, but what's the structure of that assistance? And we revealed that in places where assistance was overperforming, so high levels of assistance with lower levels of vulnerability, disbursement fell in proportion to minority households. So even where you're receiving more assistance than you would expect, minoritized households were receiving less than their neighbors, even when there was the similar level of damage suffered. And where the program was underperforming, homeowner population, assistance rose with a number of unoccupied houses. So secondary homes and that sort of stuff. But then when we look at renters, places with higher populations of non-married couples, lower income families, they were also receiving less assistance than their neighbors. And these are places or populations that we would expect to need more assistance. So what we were seeing was that the dollar value of damage was not accounting for these relative burdens of loss, because more need means that there's a greater burden of loss, and it's more difficult to overcome that loss. And so populations least able to cope, and therefore most in need of aid, may be receiving inadequate assistance, less assistance than they require, while populations that have more relative resources, because they have more stuff that is deemed more valuable, they get more assistance. So they will receive more because they've lost more, but that greater loss is a smaller proportion of their overall wealth and capacities to deal with that loss. So there's an imbalance here in who is receiving assistance and which places that assistance goes to. So you can think about a rural impoverished neighborhood. It's already impoverished. The facilities aren't there. The infrastructure is limited. And now they will be likely to receive less assistance than the neighboring quite wealthy neighborhood, simply because that neighborhood had a lot more stuff to lose. And let's shift gears a little bit. Now that we know what programs are like across the US, let's look at a more specific example, a different type of risk profile, if you will. We'll look at water availability and water security, which is closely related to it. Everybody needs water, but there's not always enough of it. And it's not always available in the right quantity or the right quality for an intended use, which creates frictions across sectors, across populations, across locations, right? Who has versus who needs. And it's incredibly important because you need water to sustain livelihoods, to sustain economic development, and to protect you from pollutions and other disasters. So it's a core component of society. So I'll focus on the Upper Colorado River Basin in the southwestern US. And it's incredibly important to look at this area because it's in the midst of a mega drought. It's one of the driest periods in the last 1,200 years. In addition to this physical lack of precipitation, and therefore lack of water in what is one of the most important river basins in the United States and northern Mexico, it's being compounded by substantial population growth and growth in water-intensive industries. So there is less water to go around, but more demand for it. And the result is intense competition for this very finite resource and disparities in who gets that resource, where that resource goes. So I will concentrate on the upper part of the basin because while the major population centers are in the lower part of the basin, it's the upper basin that climatically controls how much water is available. So my team at the USGS has tried to validate indicators. So indicators are measurable aspects of a particular theoretical phenomenon. And we want to validate indicators to figure out what is actually important in determining water availability and water security so that we can then build those indicators into physical plus social models of water. We can then look at current conditions and potentially in future get to a point where we can start forecasting water availability issues, which would be very important for decision-making processes. To do that, we also want to profile how the media represents risk. So what's important to the people in a particular place? And then get to that spatially explicit modeling of water availability. And the idea is to braid these strands of human environment interaction around water so that we can create these really useful composite physical social models, as I've said. And that would be a basis allowing our scientists to identify overall what's important, what factors we can actually account for, where we might need to get different types of data sources, and then what do we need to tell decision makers on the end product. And I am just trying to make sure that should have a little bit more time. Great. So in 2024, my team conducted a meta-analysis of empirical studies looking at social vulnerability to water security issues. The idea was to find what is being measured in the academic literature. Now, you wonder why this is important. And the idea is we just didn't know. Like, we need to find out what's out there. So we profiled over 4,000 articles and ended up on looking at 53 articles that actually measured social vulnerability. And you can see the results are all over the place. Now, ideally, if we want to say that a measure is useful, you want the academic literature to have a high level of evidence for it. So a lot of studies are using that measure and have a lot of agreement on it. So you really want to be in this top right-hand side. But that's not what we found. Most studies did measure characteristics of demographics and socioeconomics and factors of exposure, but risk perception and health were much less studied. And so we ended up in a place where do we actually know enough about how these indicators function and what they really represent that we can present them to decision makers? Or do we have to say, hey, you can look at this, but you need to look at it with a grain of salt because the academic literature is not settled on the relationship or the direction of influence to these outcomes. So we wanted to do one better, and we did move into profiling news articles, trying to figure out what people are actually saying. So we're just completing the study right now, where we've examined a corpus of over 6,500 news articles covering the period January 2020 to February 2024, the heart of this mega drought in the region. And we've combined structural topic models, which are automated processes of natural languages processing, with qualitative analysis to find out, well, what's really going on? What are these papers really saying about these issues? And then created models of water insecurity. So quality, quantity, and access, as well as risk factors, exposure, susceptibility, and coping. And the idea is in the next few months, take that stuff that we've just produced, we've already geocoded it, and produce spatial analysis of physical plus social drivers to identify indicator relationships. So just a sneak peek, because we're literally just writing up results this week. We actually found that risk framings were looking in three major ways: short-term drought, new climatic regime of aridification, so intense, persistent, more arid, dry conditions, and increased resource demands from population growth and economic growth. Three very different ways of looking at what's going on. But they also had three very different temporal framings. The ones that are looking at drought response, and it's really short term, whereas the other two, a new climatic regime or increased population demands, are looking forward and it's more long term thinking. But those are typically from state and local government perspectives, whereas the drought or hazard response is coming from the federal government or national perspectives. And I can get into what those models look like, but it's really getting down to federal appropriation dollars for hazard response, securing water rights at the local level, watershed protection at state and local level, and water rights for tribal nations in this area, because water rights determines who has access to water legally. And historically, tribal nations have not been given their water rights, and there's now a movement to rectify a lot of that, but it's often mired in legal procedures. So I wouldn't get into this. This is just a sneak peek of what's coming. And like I said, we're writing up the results right now. But basically, what we're seeing is that federal responses are short term hazard responses, and they're just this reactive, they're portrayed as reactive in the media. Whereas state and local efforts are looking at these longer processes of, hey, we need to maintain population and economic growth. And therefore, we need to find ways of managing the available water with what we think is going to happen in the future. And so they're more focused on mitigation and adaptations. And they have that much longer term process. Whereas tribal nation water rights are looking to rectify historic issues. And I think I should be just about out of time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Drakes. This is an incredible presentation. I want to first begin by thanking you guys for being there, for being here. Thank you for the incredible demonstration of new knowledge that you guys are producing in the various spaces through which that you guys both operate. And I'd like to first begin with Dr. Aggrey and then move on to Dr. Oronde with a couple of